Vunari stood quietly in the guest bathroom, away from the noise of the party. Her hands were shaking as she held the necklace her late mother had given her. It was old, but special, a gift of love and protection. She had worn it every day since her mother died, like a small piece of comfort wrapped around her neck. But now, the necklace had cracked, the chain broken. It happened just minutes ago, right after her mother-in-law, Madame Enanga, looked straight at her in front of everyone and said, "She's just the maid who got lucky." The words weren't shouted, but they hit hard, like a slap hidden behind a smile. Vunari had heard insults before. Madame Enanga never truly accepted her, always making small sharp comments to remind her she didn't belong. But this time, it was different. The insult wasn't just private or whispered. It was in public, with guests around, during a business brunch. Like Vunari was less than nothing. The broken necklace in her hand felt like a message from the universe. It didn't break from weakness. It broke to open her eyes. She stared into the mirror, her chest tight, not from sadness, but from something rising deeper inside. This wasn't just another insult. It was the final spark. In that moment, she didn't cry. She didn't feel sorry for herself. Instead, something in her heart shifted. It was like a fog clearing. She wasn't broken. She was done pretending. She saw things clearly for the first time. Who she was, what she carried, and what she was capable of. The cracked necklace wasn't a sign of loss anymore. It was a sign of change. Vunari wasn't going to stay quiet. Not today. She gently placed the necklace in her purse, took a deep breath, and wiped the corners of her eyes. There was no more fear in her face. Only calm, only focus. Her heart no longer needed the necklace to be strong. From this moment on, she would be her own strength. And that strength, quiet, steady, unshaken, was about to change everything. The sound of laughter and polished shoes filled the house as important guests arrived for the business brunch. Everything looked perfect. The expensive furniture, the sparkling dishes, the smell of freshly baked pastry. But Vunari felt like a stranger in her own home. She stood quietly near the dining table, dressed simply but neatly, her hands steady, her face calm. Inside, though, she was holding back a storm. Madame Enanga, her mother-in-law, walked around confidently, greeting the guests like a queen. She smiled, hugged people, and talked loudly about her business success and her perfect family. But when she introduced Vunari, she didn't say, "This is my son's wife," or "This is Vunari." Instead, in front of everyone, she said, "She's the housemaid who got lucky." And then she laughed like it was some small joke. Everyone looked at Vunari, some with confusion, others with polite fake smiles. For a second, everything froze around her, but she didn't react. She didn't even blink. Instead, she picked up the tray with teacup and gently poured tea for the guests, one by one. Her smile was soft. Her hands didn't shake, but deep inside, something had changed. She didn't correct Madame Enanga, not yet. She didn't tell the guests who she really was. She didn't remind them that she was the wife of Sakuro, the son of the same woman who just insulted her. Vunari knew this was not the right time. She was patient, even though her heart was hurting. She had been through worse. She knew how to stay silent and strong at the same time. As she moved around the table, offering tea, she remembered all the times Madame Enanga had made her feel small, the cold glances, the rude remarks, the times she would say, "You don't belong here," like Vunari was dirty or unworthy. And once, when she was just sitting in the living room, Madame Enanga had slammed the door on her face without a word, like her presence was a stain on everything. But Vunari didn't let it break her. She never shouted back. She never begged for love or respect. Instead, she learned how to listen quietly and plan slowly. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power, a silent kind of power that waits for the right moment. And today, that moment was coming closer. So, when Madame Enanga laughed in front of everyone and called her the maid, Vunari smiled. Not because she agreed, but because she already knew something that no one else in that room knew yet. Something big, something that would turn that fake laughter into shock. And all she had to do was wait. Months before the brunch, something important had happened. Something no one in the room that day knew, especially Madame Enanga. It was during a time when Sakero's company was going through a crisis. A big merger deal was falling apart. There was panic in the office. People were confused, and board members were arguing. But while others were busy shouting, Vunari sat quietly, listened carefully, and spoke only when she had the full picture. She had no business degree, no big title, but she understood people. She understood business from watching her mother run a small market stall, stretching little money into something useful. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. And that day, during a meeting, Sakura had invited her to attend, just as a listener. Vunari asked a few simple but sharp questions, questions that made the lawyers pause, questions that helped save the entire merger deal. After that day, Sakura started to look at her differently, not just as his wife, but as someone with real intelligence, real vision. Quietly, he started involving her more in his business decisions. He would share reports with her, ask for her opinions, and slowly realized she wasn't just smart, she was brilliant. She saw things others missed. She stayed calm when others panicked, and she gave advice not to sound clever, but to truly help. One night, after a long talk, Sakura did something unexpected. He handed her a set of papers. In those papers, he had signed over a large portion of his company shares to Vunari, not because he felt sorry for her, not because she asked, but because he trusted her, because she had proven her worth in silence and dignity. Vunari was shocked at first. She asked him if he was sure. He smiled and said, "You saved us, Vunari. You saw the cracks before they broke. I don't want a wife who waits for a seat. I want a partner who builds the table." And so, just like that, Vunari became the majority shareholder in the company. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't change her walk or her voice. She kept showing up at family dinners, doing chores, smiling through Madame Inanga's insult. She let everyone think she was just a quiet wife with no power, because behind that soft smile was a master plan, a quiet storm, a truth waiting for the perfect time to be revealed. And that time was getting closer with every sip of tea at the brunch. Before Vunari ever met Sakura, her life was very different. She didn't grow up in a rich home or have a fancy education. She didn't wear expensive clothes or sit in air-conditioned offices. Instead, she stood behind a small wooden table at the local market, selling fruits, spices, and sometimes handmade items. The sun was hot, the work was hard, and the days were long. But Vunari never gave up. She woke up early every morning, arranged her goods neatly, and wore a smile even when her heart was tired. She remembered how people used to treat her. Many didn't even look her in the eye. They talked at her like she was invisible, like she was just another poor girl trying to survive. Some customers would throw money at the table, speak rudely, or walk away without saying thank you. Others would say things like, "Girls like you are meant to stay here. You'll never matter to anyone important." At first, those words hurt. She would go home at night and cry quietly, asking herself if they were right. But over time, those moments changed her. They didn't break her. They built her. Each rude comment, each look of disrespect, each insult became a silent lesson. She started watching people closely. She learned who was kind without showing off and who smiled with poison behind their words. She learned how to listen, how to speak carefully, and how to never let anyone know what she was truly thinking. The market taught her more than school ever could. It taught her patience. Sometimes she would sit for hours with no sales, but she never packed up early. She waited because she knew the right buyer would come, even if it was late. She learned that rushing things often leads to loss. And now, as an adult in a rich home, surrounded by people who wore suits but spoke with hidden knives, those same lessons helped her stay calm. The market also taught her about power. Not the kind that shouts or shows off, but the quiet kind, the kind that watches, waits, and then acts at the right time. Vunari carried that power with her now, hidden beneath her gentle voice and soft smile. When Madame Inanga looked down on her, she didn't react. She didn't need to, because she had faced worse. Because she had already learned the secret most people never learn. Real strength doesn't need to scream. It just needs to last. So even now, as the world around her tried to push her down, Vunari stood tall inside. Every painful moment from the market had given her a gift. Not scars, but strength. Not bitterness, but wisdom. And that wisdom was about to change everything. The brunch was going on smoothly, at least from the outside. Laughter, clinking glasses, the smell of rich food, and the soft sound of music in the background made everything look perfect. Madame Inanga was in her element, walking proudly between the guests, making jokes, talking about her hard work and dedication. Then she stood up, lifted a glass of champagne, and with a big smile on her face, announced that she was being officially promoted to the position of CEO of the family company. Everyone clapped politely. Some even cheered. Vunari stood quietly in a corner, still smiling, still calm. She clapped along with everyone else, but inside, she felt nothing. No anger, no rush, just a calm readiness. She knew what was about to happen, and she knew no one in that room was prepared for it. She gently placed her glass down and excused herself, saying she needed to check on something upstairs. No one paid much attention. Madame Enanga continued her celebration, soaking in the attention and compliments. But Vunari, once upstairs, opened her laptop. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved quickly but steadily. She opened a saved folder, clicked on a single document, and took a breath. The title read, New CEO Appointment, Effective Immediately. It was the official legal document that confirmed her as the new CEO of Enanga Holdings, signed by the board, sealed by the lawyer, and backed by her majority shares. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the truth, a truth that had been waiting quietly in her hands. Now, it was time to show it. She clicked forward. Then, carefully, she typed in the email addresses of every guest sitting downstairs, one by one. Every partner, investor, family friend, and business contact. She added no message, no explanation, just the document, and then she hit send. Downstairs, the room buzzed with light conversation, but soon phones started pinging. First one, then another, then more. The sound of email notifications slowly replaced the laughter. Confused faces looked at their screens. A few gasped. Some eyes widened. Someone read the title out loud. New CEO Appointment. Effective immediately. The room fell into a strange silence. Madame Enanga noticed something was wrong, but didn't understand what yet. She stood frozen, her smile stuck on her face. Meanwhile, Vunari walked calmly back down the stairs, her face soft, her steps graceful, like nothing unusual had happened. But everything had changed, and everyone in the room now knew. The real power had just arrived, and it was wearing a quiet smile. The sound of phones buzzing slowly filled the room. One guest looked down at their screen, then another, then a third. The cheerful noise from earlier began to fade as everyone focused on what they had just received. Confused whispers started. Eyes darted from phone to phone, from guest to guest. The air in the room began to shift, like something heavy had suddenly landed. Madame Enanga, still holding her champagne glass, laughed again, trying to continue her celebration. But this time, no one joined her. Her laughter sounded too loud, too forced. She looked around, her smile beginning to fade. "What's going on?" she asked, still trying to keep control. Then, one guest holding up their phone cleared their throat and read the message aloud, appointing Mrs. Vunari Sakero as the new CEO of Enanga Holdings, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like thunder. A long silence followed. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from shock. Madame Enanga blinked. "No, that can't be real. It must be a mistake," she said quickly, laughing nervously, trying to brush it off. But no one was laughing with her now. All eyes turned toward the staircase, because at that very moment, Vunari was walking back into the room. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. Her steps were soft, almost silent. Her face was calm, her eyes focused. She wasn't smiling with joy, but there was a quiet power in the way she carried herself. She looked like a woman who didn't come to argue, but to confirm what had already been done. The guests slowly stepped back, making space for her without even thinking. It was like the energy in the room had shifted completely, like everyone now saw her in a new light, not as a maid, not as someone's wife, but as a leader, as the one now in charge. Madame Enanga stared at her, her mouth slightly open. She looked at the phones, the email, the guests. "This can't be real," she whispered again. But even she could hear how weak her voice had become. Vunari stood tall, right in front of her. No shouting, no revenge in her tone, just truth, just presence. The same woman they had laughed at, ignored and dismissed, was now the one holding the highest seat in the company. And she hadn't said a word. She didn't need to, because now her silence was louder than anything Madame Enanga had ever said. The silence in the room was getting heavier by the second. Madame Enanga's hands were shaking slightly as she looked around at the guests, then back at her phone, then at Vunari, who stood calm and still like a mountain. The room felt unfamiliar now. It was no longer hers. The attention, the power, the respect, it had shifted. Suddenly, Madame Enanga slammed her glass down on the table, making everyone jump. "Call the lawyer!" she shouted, her voice loud and sharp. "There must be a mistake. This is not legal." But before anyone could even move, a man from the far end of the room stood up. He adjusted his suit, cleared his throat, and looked directly at her. "Madam," he said gently, but clearly, "I'm the one who drafted the papers." Everyone turned to look at him. Madam Inanga stared at him like she didn't recognize him. "What do you mean?" "I'm the family lawyer," he continued. "Your son, Mr. Sakero, signed everything, and the board voted last week to approve the new CEO. Madam Inanga's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide in disbelief. You knew all this time?" "Yes," the lawyer replied calmly. "This is final, legal, and official." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She looked around the room again, but this time there were no friendly faces, no supporters, just stunned silence and curious stares. Everyone was watching her fall, quietly and completely. Then, without raising her voice or changing her calm expression, Vunari walked a few steps forward. She pulled a small napkin from her pocket, folded it neatly, and handed it to Madam Inanga. "For your lipstick," she said with a soft smile. "It's running." The words were simple, but they landed like thunder. It wasn't just about lipstick. It was about pride, image, and the moment everything crumbled, Madame Inanga took the napkin with shaky fingers, her face red, her breathing heavy. She had always believed she was in control, always thought she could embarrass Vunari and walk away laughing. But now, the woman she once called the Maid had just taken the highest seat in the company, without shouting, without fighting, just truthfully, legally, and gracefully. The room remained silent, everyone watching the moment like it was something out of a movie. Vunari didn't gloat, she didn't boast. She simply turned and walked back to her place, her steps light and unbothered. And just like that, the crown that Madame Inanga thought would always be hers had quietly slipped away, right into the hands of the woman she had tried to break. The room slowly started to breathe again, but nothing felt the same. The once cheerful brunch had turned into something else, something unforgettable. Guests stood frozen with their phones in hand, their expressions mixed with shock, amusement, and curiosity. A few tried to hide their smiles behind their glasses. Some whispered to each other, others just stared at Vunari with new eyes. One or two brave ones stepped forward to quietly say, "Congratulations," with a slight nod of respect. But everyone felt it, the shift. The power was no longer where it used to be. Vunari didn't rush to speak. She stood in silence, letting the truth settle in the air. Her hands were calm by her sides, her face steady, but inside her chest, her heart was beating fast. Not from fear, but from years of buried emotion finally finding air. She looked around the room, at the faces that once saw her as invisible, at the woman who had tried so hard to silence her. And then, slowly, she stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud. In fact, it trembled a little, but the room was so quiet, you could hear every single word. "I didn't come to replace you," she said gently, her eyes meeting Madame Inanga's. "I came to prove I was never beneath you." Those words were soft, but they carried the weight of everything she had been through. Every insult, every look of disrespect, every time she was treated like she didn't belong. She wasn't here to get revenge. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about standing up, finally, fully, and being seen for who she truly was. Madame Inanga didn't say anything. She just stared back, her mouth slightly open, her pride slowly fading into silence. There was no more shouting, no more fake laughter, just silence, and the sound of truth cutting through the air like a blade. Vunari turned to face the guests again, her voice steadier now. She wasn't smiling with pride. Her eyes held something deeper, something peaceful. She had finally taken her place, not by force, but by fact. She had walked through fire and stood tall, without shouting, without fighting dirty. And now, the aftershock was all around. People would talk about this day for a long time, about the quiet woman who once poured tea, and later walked in as the CEO. They would remember not just the twist, but the way she handled it, with grace, with truth, and without a single word wasted. Because the real power wasn't in the title, it was in how she earned it. During the entire brunch, while everything was falling apart for Madame Inanga and rising for Vunari, Sakero remained silent. He didn't say a single word. He sat quietly, watching, listening, observing the moment unfold. Some guests noticed his silence. and found it strange. After all, he was the son, the link between both women. Why wasn't he stepping in? Why wasn't he saying anything to stop the chaos? But Vunari didn't look to him for help. She had already walked this path alone. Still, later that evening, when they were alone in their room, she finally asked him, gently, "Why didn't you say anything?" Sakero looked at her, not with guilt or confusion, but with calm eyes full of meaning. His voice was quiet but honest. "Because my mother wanted someone she could control, a puppet who would smile and nod and do what she says. But I didn't marry a puppet. I wanted a partner, a real one." Vunari looked at him, her heart full. He continued, "You didn't need me to speak today. The world finally saw who you are. You spoke in your own way, and they listened." At that moment, Vunari's heart swelled with emotion. All day she had held back her tears. Through the insult, through the power shift, through the silence in the room when the truth came out, she had stayed calm for so long. But now, in this quiet moment, the tears came, not from sadness, not from pain, but from relief. She didn't cry because she won. She cried because she had finally been seen, truly seen, not just by strangers or guests, but by the man who mattered most, the man who had chosen her, believed in her, and stood by her silently when the world finally opened its eyes. It wasn't just the words that moved her, it was what they meant. For so long, she had fought silently, been insulted, overlooked, underestimated, and now someone had finally said, "You don't need saving, you already stood on your own." She leaned into him, and he gently held her. No fancy speeches, no dramatic moments, just quiet understanding, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. In that soft silence, Vunari let go of everything she had been carrying, not the strength, but the weight. And in that release, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, real peace, because now she didn't just survive, she was finally free. After the brunch, Vunari became the center of attention. Her name was on everyone's lips. Some guests began calling, reporters wanted interviews, and the PR team from the company came to her with big ideas. They suggested turning her story into a campaign. "Let's show the world your journey," they said. "Let's go viral. Let's tell everyone how you rose from nothing to CEO." But Vunari quietly shook her head. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't need to prove anything to the world anymore. She had already said everything she needed to say by standing her ground, by staying calm, by letting her actions speak. Fame wasn't her goal. Peace was. Instead of chasing applause, she went straight to work. Day after day, she walked into her office, rolled up her sleeves, and focused on the real problem. The company had cracks, issues that had been ignored for too long. Vunari began to fix them, one by one. She listened to staff, reviewed reports, made changes. She didn't bark orders or demand respect. She earned it, quietly, firmly, with grace. People in the office began to admire her, not because of what happened at the brunch, but because of how she led afterward. She was fair, but firm, kind, but clear. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence was enough. Months passed. The gossip faded. The noise around her story died down. But Vunari kept going, not for praise, but because she believed in building something better. And then, one day, a small envelope arrived on her desk. No stamps, no formal company name, just her name written in soft handwriting. It was from Madame Inanga. Inside, just a short note. "I misjudged you, but you earned this." Vunari read the note once, then folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer. She didn't reply. She didn't call. She didn't send a message. There was no need, because some victories are not about loud wins or public apologies. Some battles are not finished with words, but with silence. Powerful, peaceful silence. And in that silence, Vunari found something stronger than revenge. She found peace. If this story moved you, don't scroll without sharing, because someone out there needs to be reminded. You don't have to scream to be powerful. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than applause. Drop a heart in the comments if you know your worth. Share this with every woman who's ever been underestimated. Follow for more powerful stories that hit where it matters, right in the truth.